Hi everyone, good Tuesday afternoon and welcome to GoLocal Live. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the news, politics, lifestyle, and more show. And as we do most Tuesdays, catch up with Professor Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Another week, another round of news items that continue to change hourly, but let's talk about who's not going to testify, who's not complying with subpoenas. Let's start with Ambassador Sondland has dominated the news cycle for the, I'd say, past 24 hours about his role in the Ukraine, and then the White House saying that they are not going to allow him to provide testimony.
Right, so he was supposed to provide testimony today, and apparently the House committee found out only about a half an hour before he was supposed to show up that he, in fact, wouldn't be. And he is not going to comply with a subpoena either. Now, the interesting thing about this situation is that his text messages were at the center of the fallout over the weekend. He's the one who texted there was no quid pro quo. The president would never do that. What broke today was that the time lag in between the concern that this could look like a quid pro quo and that text was that he was actually on the phone with President Trump. And so there's quite a bit of information that suggests that something sketchy was going on here, and the House committee is not going to get the opportunity, at least in the next few days, to hear about that.
Repercussions for not complying with subpoenas?
There used to be some. It's unclear what will happen now. I mean, in some ways, the Democrats are trying to have their cake and eat it too, I think, because if there is this continual refusal to comply with subpoenas, they can suggest that Donald Trump should be impeached on grounds of obstruction of justice as well. If he's making it virtually impossible for this investigation to move forward and for the information that's needed to get out there, those could actually be additional charges. The downside for the Democrats, of course, is that if they continue to issue subpoenas and no one complies with them, it makes them look weak, and it makes Congress look like, in a lot of ways, a secondary branch of government. So, they've got to walk a fine line here, but I don't think it's particularly devastating to not get this information, or because the way that they're not getting it is consistent with an obstruction of justice case.
At what point would we see that bubble up to that level? Again, would there need to be additional subpoenas that were not complied with? How far would it need to go for an obstruction of justice charge?
Well, I mean, based on what we're hearing today, there's already enough for an obstruction of justice charge. The question is whether it's politically feasible to do that. Legally, it seems like the ingredients are in place. The question becomes, when you've got virtually every single Democrat in the House willing to move forward on impeachment when the scope of the discussion is limited to Ukraine, do you lose any of them if it looks like you've overreached? And so I think that becomes the tricky point.
And then, of course, Rudy Giuliani saying he will not go before the House Intelligence Committee. But you say folks can learn what he'd say anyhow other places.
Rudy Giuliani saying that he's not going to go in front of a Senate committee is absolutely appalling and silly, in my view, because he goes on CNN, he goes on Fox News, he talks to reporters all the time and doesn't claim executive privilege, doesn't claim client attorney confidentiality. But when the rubber meets the road and he's actually going to be under oath, all of these factors come into play. And so I think it looks very, very political. I think it's also one of these situations where he wants to spin the narrative and he wants to walk out when he's ready to walk out. And that's not what happens when you testify in front of these committees. But again, this does not help the Republicans. It's like the Trump administration is doing everything it possibly can to make people suspicious of their actions. And if they really did nothing wrong, then these are a bizarre set of circumstances that they're creating in their own defense.
Of course, Trump via Twitter has made a number of assertions and accusations, calling it a kangaroo court. He also said that in his great and unmatched wisdom should not be challenged as it pertains to international affairs. Let's look outside the Beltway. Obviously, Leader McConnell pushing him, disagreeing with his decision to pull out of Syria. Let's talk a little bit about that. With so much focus right now domestically and the potential for impeachment, obviously dominating the news cycle, perhaps over the last 24 hours, is again the U.S.'s change in the Middle East.
Well, I think what's really important to keep in mind about what's going on in the Middle East is that you've got virtually every Republican leader in the Senate saying that Donald Trump is making a mistake here, and this cannot be the policy that the United States pursues. It's bad for our allies, it's bad for global security, and it's bad for international relations in general. And there are not a lot of opportunities that the president provides for Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and a bunch of other Republican leaders to feel comfortable questioning his judgment. And I think this actually ties into impeachment because it demonstrates that on certain dimensions, the Republicans, when provided with compelling evidence or a clear set of wrong decisions on the part of the White House, are willing to stop him. We saw this with the sanctions against Russia as well. And so, it's not like the Democrats have no shot whatsoever at convincing Republicans to impeach. It's that they've got to come up with evidence that is so compelling and that so flies in the face of what's seen as acceptable that Republicans will get on board. Now, whether that's fair or whether that's an insurmountable bar becomes a different question. But when we see in the realm of international relations and foreign policy, Republicans willing to push back against the Trump administration, I think it probably gives some Democrats hope. And the fact that the grounds for impeachment now are linked to the Ukraine and linked to foreign policy and the way that there could be foreign interference in our elections is probably helpful.
And let's talk a little bit on the Democratic side, fairly quiet on the Joe Biden front, but let's talk a little bit, Bernie Sanders obviously having some health issues. How will that impact his campaign?
Well, Bernie Sanders' health issues are obviously cueing people to his age, which is not particularly helpful. I mean, he's very, very vibrant, and I think that a lot of people forget when he's on the campaign trail that he's 78 years old. But having a heart attack and needing surgery is a good way to remind people of that. I think that he'll be back out on the campaign trail. His campaign says that he'll participate in the October 15th debate, but the campaign was already losing steam, and I'm not sure that this injects more momentum into it. That's obviously good news for Elizabeth Warren because they're pulling at the same voters. The bad news for Elizabeth Warren, of course, is that the latest story about her feeds into this narrative that she's a little bit of a liar. So similar to the Native American heritage problem, she now has this other problem where she claims, and she has claimed over time, that she was wrongfully terminated because she was a young woman who was pregnant. And it turns out that that's not the case. Her contract as an educator was renewed, and then she resigned, and the Board of Education, regretfully accepted her resignation. And so it's a tiny, tiny little thing. It's not a big deal. But I think that it plays into this broader narrative of when given the opportunity to exaggerate, to make a compelling case, maybe she will. And both of these things, Sanders' health and Elizabeth Warren's lie, are good news for Joe Biden.
Let's talk a little bit more about Warren. Of course, she said that she was de facto forced out by lieu of being a pregnant woman back in the day, when apparently employers could summarily dismiss pregnant women. But again, the power of the press pulling up. She herself admitted her stepping away, again, not being, in her own words, qualified for the position, not having the requisite courses and study to be able to take it. So, you say it's good news for Joe Biden. What would happen if Elizabeth Warren were to emerge from the Democratic primary, face a Donald Trump with what we see that he already pins on her already?
I don't think it matters. I've actually reached the point in time where I now believe that whoever the Democratic nominee is, that person will either win or lose. And I don't think anybody has one particular advantage over another. They might tap into different voters. They might energize and mobilize different groups of voters differently. But if a Democrat wins, I think all of these Democrats could probably win. And if Donald Trump is the ultimate victor, I think he probably would have defeated all of these Democrats. I do think that as far as the primary is concerned, it's likely that on October 15th, Elizabeth Warren is for the first time going to be treated with frontrunner status. She's going to be standing in the middle of that stage, and these attacks are going to be lobbed at her. In the meantime, for the last 2 weeks and for the next 2 weeks, Joe Biden is able to run a campaign against Donald Trump and highlight how Donald Trump clearly fears him most, which is what we know Democratic voters care most about this time around. And so, although questions about Hunter Biden and ethical improprieties and conflicts of interest are relevant, and I'm sure that Biden will be asked about them, that's sort of in the weeds to the American people. For Democratic voters, who can knock Donald Trump off is first and foremost in the front of their minds. And, I think Joe Biden has been dealt a hand right now that helps him make that case.
Let's talk a little bit about the president and kind of where he sits right now in terms of his base that he was elected with, and of course what we've seen with recent events. Who is he losing potentially from his supporting base? And then is he picking up any of the undecideds moving forward who think that this is governmental overreach? Let's talk about that swap and who he's got, who he's losing, and who he could potentially be gaining.
I mean, he's losing independents, and independent women in particular. And it's not because of the impeachment inquiry. I mean, that's a little piece of it, but it's been his behavior over the course of the last 3 years. And we saw how independent women voted in the 2018 midterm elections, and that's a large part of the reason why Democrats got the House back. And so if you think about 2016 and you think about the gender gap among independents, you had about a 5 percentage point advantage where independent women voted for Clinton over Trump. Among men, you had about a 15 percentage point advantage where they voted for Trump over Clinton. In 2020, it's hard to imagine that women won't break for the Democratic candidate by at least 15 percentage points, and that can decide an election. Now, they have to live in the right places. We don't only care about independent women in California or in New York, but assuming that they behave in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania the same way, and there's no reason to believe that they won't, that's very, very good news for whoever the Democratic candidate is. As far as the Republicans are concerned, Donald Trump has an advantage in that a lot of these first-time Republican voters who were new to the electorate last time are now fully sort of ensconced in the minutia of electoral politics, and they'll turn out again. Mm-hmm. So he has a little bit of, less rough terrain to go over because he already motivated a lot of these people the first time around. So it'll be, I think, less of a heavy lift to get these Republicans on board. But I mean, if I were a betting woman and the election were held today, I would say that I'd rather be the Democrat than Donald Trump. Now, fast forward a year and everything could look a lot different.
Fast forward a week, what are we keeping an eye on in the coming days before we talk again?
Well, I think the most important thing to continue to look at is what this impeachment inquiry looks like and whether the White House decides to comply or continue to obstruct. That's one very, very important thing. The other thing that's important is, the Supreme Court is back, and probably surprising to Donald Trump, it looks like Neil Gorsuch might very well be the deciding vote in these transgender cases. And so that would be somewhat of a surprise if it turns out, based on opening arguments today and questions, it seemed like he might be somewhat amenable to the notion that the Civil Rights Act should in fact cover discrimination against gays and transgender citizens.
Well, we're going to continue to keep an eye inside the Beltway, but as always, we appreciate taking the time to get in touch with you down at UVA and get the latest in national politics. So Jennifer Lawless, thank you for taking the time to tune in.
See you next week.
Okay, we're going to let Jen Lawless go. We're going to get a lot more local here, so don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back here on GoLocal Live.